I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. We've got some great summer books to recommend, but first, since the pandemic, there seems to be a widening divide between New York City and the suburbs. What are some of the causes of those mounting tensions? Crime, immigration, congestion pricing, just to name a few. Metro correspondent Jesse McKinley joining us from Albany. Jesse, thanks for joining us. The suburbs had never really liked New York City. One of the first suburbs was Brooklyn Heights. People moved there to get out of Manhattan. What's different this time?
Well, I think it's a confluence of things. I think obviously you're right. The suburbs and the city have never particularly gotten along, but they have had to cooperate on things, whether it's the Port Authority, whether it's infrastructure projects, whether it's Hudson River crossings. But at each of these moments, there have been flashpoints, whether it's tolls or taxes or things like that. But I think what you're seeing right now is a number of issues that have kind of come to a head at the same time. And that was most centrally, located on the issue of the migrants and Mayor Adams's plan to basically, with very little notice and sometimes no notice, send busloads of migrants to suburban communities, places like Rockland County and further north even. And I think for county executives in those communities, that really was an affront, not only from a logistical standpoint, but just from a cooperation standpoint. And as you mentioned, that came, after things like the affordable housing plan, which Governor Hochul had wanted to pass, which would have helped, obviously the city with its affordable housing problems, as well as, other issues like congestion pricing, which really upset New Jerseyites as well as some Long Islanites, who felt that once again they were being dinged to come into the city to do their jobs, to help regrow the economy in New York City. They were being given another fee, another toll, another tax. And I think it was just a question of, at what point is the city going to solve its own problems? And the suburbs just feel like it's not their problem.
Well, it's a question of whose problem is it, of course, Jesse. And let's look at migrants for a minute. Where does it say in the Constitution that the suburbs have a right not to give shelter to migrants wherever they come from? Doesn't the Constitution guarantee a right to shelter, whether they wind up coming from New York City or anywhere else? Why doesn't the city sue those counties, or is it doing that? And what's the status of those legal suits?
In some cases, they have. I mean, the first kind of barrage of legal actions was the other way around. It was the suburban counties and some municipalities actually suing the city or threatening to sue the city for this action. And the city has countersued in some cases. Those cases are obviously kind of in process. And as for the constitutional issues, I'm not a legal scholar, but in some cases, places like Albany, they are sanctuary cities, and they have done their very best to kind of accept the migrants, to house them, to shelter them, et cetera. And it also bears noting that in many cases, New York City is paying to not only ship them, but also to help out with basic services. But I think the bigger issue here is not even a legal issue, it's a communication issue. And it's a question of the suburban counties simply feeling like they were not looped in on this, that they were not advised to it, that they were not given a heads up. Even in places where there have been kind of very angry responses, you talk to the county executives there, and they say, look, we are trying to help. We understand that these people are in a state of hardship, that they have come a long way, that oftentimes they're impoverished or disoriented and do need help, and we are willing to help. But the way in which New York City went about this with very little notice and a kind of, caveat emptor approach to it really aggrieved them and made them upset. And for them, it was just another example of New York seemingly doing things of their own accord without a lot of cooperation and communication.
They seem to have a good point on that score. Congestion pricing, why are they any more aggrieved than drivers in Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, Staten Island, who are going to have to pay that congestion pricing fee going into Midtown, Lower Manhattan as well?
Well, I think you're right. I think there's a lot of agita to go around, and obviously the caveat here should be, look, there are people living in the outer boroughs who are not particularly pleased with this either. But I think for New Jerseyites, it comes on top of, fairly substantial tolls on Hudson River crossings. The GW, I think it's 18, 19, 20. I don't even know at this point. But it just seems like another ding. And quite frankly, I think you can make the argument that even, parking garages and fees like that people have to pay to get into the city and get into the central corridor, into Midtown Manhattan, are simply really nickel and diming people to a point that it just causes bad blood. And you've seen this this is not just a Republican Democratic issue. Obviously, the city is a Democratic stronghold, but in New Jersey in particular, Governor Murphy, who is a Democrat, and Josh Gottenheimer, who is a prominent Democrat that represents Jersey's northern suburbs, they're both aggrieved about this. They both don't like it. And the Jersey General Assembly basically is trying to pass a law that says, hey, listen, stay in Jersey. Don't go into the city. You don't need to go into the city. We'll incentivize you to work from home. So it's indications like that when we're putting together a story like this, give us good evidence and good bullet points to support the idea that this is not just usual suburbs versus city bickering, but that there's kind of a deeper wound at work here.
Since 1898, or even before that, when the city consolidated into what became the 5 boroughs, there were always questions about whether that consolidation should have taken in a broader area, maybe parts of Jersey, Long Island, more of Westchester. But aren't there issues like housing, like transportation, that should be approached more regionally? Here, the business tax to help support the MTA, the suburbs got out of that, and the issue, as you mentioned, affordable housing on a statewide basis. The suburbs don't want any part of that, don't want their larger lot size condensed to be able to take more dense housing. Something, interestingly enough, that even people in East New York don't want, because they don't want more density. They don't want more so-called affordable housing, lower income housing in their neighborhood. How do we reconcile those things?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think in large part I've given voice to some of the suburban grievances, but let's be clear, for city leaders, they see a lot of the suburban opposition to these things as selfish. They see it as one-sided, short-sighted, and in some cases racially fraught. Obviously the original sin, some say, of the suburbs was race, that a lot of people fled central corridors, not only in New York, but in other places because of racial grievances and racial ugliness. And I think, particularly with the migrant issue, race has come up, that some of these suburbs, which are predominantly white, simply don't want people of other ethnic heritages coming to their towns. By the same token, on issues like transportation, you are absolutely right. These are regional systems. The MTA is a regional system, the LIRR, Metro North, et cetera. They are serving the suburbs to let those people come into cities to earn big incomes and then retreat to the suburbs where they can, eat at Panera or whatever they want to do. So there's a lot of city leaders who simply feel that the suburbs are not carrying their fair share. I think you mentioned that MTA tax, where the suburbs managed to get themselves carved out of it. And that tax is going to fall on New York City businesses to help pay to rebuild the MTA. So the city leaders also have a very credible argument that the suburbs are taking advantage of the city and not carrying their weight.
And what about crime? Crime does not stop at a certain border. Is the problem with the suburbs the perception of crime in the city, or is it a reality these days?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think that in particular in the 2022 election cycle, the Republicans made hay out of crime. They won they flipped 4 congressional races, 3 of which were in New York City suburbs, from Republican to Democrat to Republican. And the issue of crime was always there. The issue of bail reform, which was another fraught issue, was a valuable one and a potent one for Republicans. So the Republicans have certainly whipped this up. Now, keep in mind, crime did go up post-pandemic. But it has also started to come down, and New York City remains one of the safest large cities in the United States. And particular violent crime has decreased in New York City. So it is a question of a little bit of reality and a little bit of perception and a little bit of politicking. Obviously, the Republicans will probably run on this again next year. Public safety is always a big issue. And in talking to suburbanites, for reporting the story, it has definitely penetrated their perception of the city, that the city is, crime-ridden, et cetera. Some of this is, however, whipped up by tabloids and right-wing media to make it worse than it actually is.
Jesse, the pandemic has obviously emptied a lot of office space in the city, in Manhattan in particular. How much of that would have been occupied by people commuting from the suburbs who are now working remotely?
Well, I think that's an ongoing problem, and I think it's something that the mayor and others are going to have to address. I mean, office occupancy is down and does not seem to be recovering. And certainly the idea of working from home, you and I are conducting this interview on Zoom right now. It is pretty easy not to have to go into an office and talk face to face. So the suburbanites that were filling those offices have not come back at the same level. Now, keep in mind, some businesses are trying to force people back into the offices. I think that would certainly help the city's economy, even street level economy, lunch places and delis and places like that. But I don't think there's a quick fix to this. I think that the kind of model, the business model has changed. And I think businesses are adapting, and that is not great news if you own an office building.
Of course, we're trying to help suburbs, trying to lure commuters. The new Grand Central Terminal, maybe not so new anymore, but still very grand. Plans for a new bus terminal, the new Long Island access to Grand Central Terminal as well. And the new Penn Station, if it ever gets off the ground as well. Thanks to Jesse McKinley, New York Times Metro correspondent, joining us from Albany. And coming up next, some of the great summer read recommendations from the book review. Summer is here. It's time to enjoy life even more, whether relaxing on the beach, the backyard, reading a good book while doing nothing else is part of an ideal scene in any season. And the New York Times is here to help with interactive summer books. It's out now. Joining us now with some summer reading recommendations is Tina Jordan, deputy editor of the New York Times Book Review. Who reads book reviews and how much impact do they have, Tina?
The New York Times Book Review still has a tremendous impact. We know from publishers, they will tell us there's a sales bump when there's a review, for example. It is the last remaining. Well, wait a minute. I must qualify that because the Washington Post has restarted their Sunday book section. But we're 126 years old.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, except for the Post now, there are no standalone book review sections at all.
No.
So how do you choose? You get so many books a week. How do you choose which ones to review?
So we've got this capable staff of preview editors. And I've sort of divided books up among them as they come in. Now, we used to have a philosophy, I think, for most of the book review, that the book review would look at every book published. We cover the waterfront. That was our mantra. I'm here to tell you that with between 50 and 100,000 books published a year, that's not possible any longer.
It's sort of the problem we have in choosing who to write obituaries
That's
about.
exactly right. And I think the guiding principle I keep in my own mind is we want to make sure that we cover the books that are importantly good or importantly bad. But we also don't want to lose sight of the smaller idiosyncratic books, the books where 30 years down the line, the author is going to win a Nobel Prize, right? Like you can't concentrate just on the big. So we are looking at books from the big 5 publishers, but we're also looking at books from independent presses, university presses. We just closed. It went to the printer yesterday, an issue on translated literature, and every single piece in the issue is about books and is either a book in translation or it's a feature about books in translation. And I'm not sure there's a big publisher represented there.
These are such subjective decisions in a way, sort of like restaurant reviews. It's a question of people's palate. If a reviewer likes a book and says, I just love this book, it's so terrific, how do we know that the reader is going to like it too?
Well, we don't. And I have to tell you, as someone who's worked as a preview editor, it's absolutely crushing when you read a book, you love it, you want the Times like fire hose to be behind it. You send it to that freelance reviewer and they don't like it. And then it's a review you're running, right? You cannot not run a review because the reviewer thinks differently than you do. And it's just crushing when that happens.
How many books do you read a year, and how do you read them? Do you read them in print, in Kindle, an audiobook?
So I read them all different ways is the answer. During the pandemic, publishers stopped producing galleys. So I had to read everything electronically. I used an iPad. I grew to like it, but it ruined my vision, frankly. I need much stronger glasses than I used to. So now I do try to balance it and do both. I do like having an iPad, for example, for my commute, because I'm not lugging a monstrous bag of books anymore. I've also come around to audio. I resisted audio for a while, and I get it. But I use audio to catch up on things behind me that I've missed, if that makes sense.
How does the experience differ? I mean, do you get the same insights? Do you get the same feeling from those different platforms?
You do. Here's what's so interesting about audio. It's a completely different experience, and you do have to pay attention. You can't be doing a million other things unless it's, a mindless cleaning task or something. I can do it while I'm listen while I'm doing the laundry. I have found something very interesting in the case of well-done nonfiction audiobooks, which is when it's a thorny, knotty, say, scientific subject that I know little about, when you have a good narrator, you understand the concept, or I understand the concepts better than I do if I'm just reading myself.
How
it's like
interesting.
listening to a good teacher.
How interesting. Well, it's all about storytelling.
It's all about storytelling, right?
Speaking of which, you've recommended some books for summer reading. Tell us a couple of them and why you've recommended them.
So I'm going to start with fiction, if that's all right.
Sure.
I recommended a few, and let me preface this by saying I don't like the term beach reads, and I almost don't like the term summer reads either, although I should tell you that the Book Review has done a summer reading issue every single year of its existence, because I feel like
I like to read in every season.
I do too, and I feel like beach reads is a little derogatory, right? Like
Yeah,
I think
it is.
people think,
It's mindless.
Mindless. I'm here to tell you no. I think what a beach read is, I think they can be thought-provoking and smart. They can also be juicy. I think they're propulsive reads. I think they're page turners. And for some people, that's fiction. For other people, that's nonfiction, right? One of our editors and writers whom I really respect said, a beach read is your stylish, aunt who drives in the convertible with the top down, the fun spinster aunt. But I get that metaphor, right? Yeah.
So what are some of the ones on your list?
So I know that one of the ones on my list is a book called Loot by Tanya James. It's historical fiction, which is not something I usually turn to. And it's set in 1790 in India. It's about a young teenage Muslim woodcarver who's summoned to help a French clockmaker build an automaton for the ruler of Mysore. And
Not something I would ordinarily
No.
grab.
it's a mechanical animal, life size. It's of a tiger mauling and eating a British soldier in his iconic red jacket. When you wind it up, the tiger, chomps on his neck and the man flails, whatever. It's a real thing.
And the next one.
Okay, I know I recommended a book called The Soulmate by Sally Hepworth, which is a psychological thriller that asks, how well do we really know the person we've married?
Dangerous question.
It's a dangerous question because this particular husband may have been involved in a murder. Fantasy novel, a debut called Ink Blood Sister Scribe. I just want to say that to me, the strength of a fantasy novel is how well the author constructs that world that they place you in. And sometimes I have trouble with fantasy novels for that reason, but this one completely sucked me in.
And what about the nonfiction books you've recommended?
Nonfiction.
A couple of those.
A couple of those. I really want to stress one called Fire Weather by John Vaillant, which is about a 2016 wildfire in Canada. And what makes it so interesting is that writers nowadays have access to so much more primary source material than they used to.
And this is a very timely topic.
It's very timely. So, security cameras at businesses and homes were transmitting images as flames licked at the buildings. There's police and fire scanner, readouts, text messages, cell phone videos. And he really constructs this biography of a fire, actually. I now understand more about the science of fire than I used to. Let me just put it that way.
One of the things that you would notice more than most people very quickly is, are there book editors anymore, book editors as we knew them in the old sense? I mean,
in the Robert Gottlieb sense?
Robert Gottlieb sense, in the Bob Loomis sense, in the sense of people like that who really took the time to edit books with a pencil.
There are. And may I just say, when you read one of those books, you know it. Because so much does not get proper editing these days, especially when it comes to nonfiction. When I read a terrific piece of nonfiction and see the perfectly put together puzzle, I know that person has not only slaved over that book, but an editor has been involved, because everybody needs an editor.
Everyone needs an editor. I'm the first to admit that. Thanks to Tina Jordan, the deputy editor of the New York Times Book Review, and you can see those recommendations online at nytimes.com. And coming up next, my thoughts on the 4th of July. Remember America's bicentennial? The celebration couldn't have come at a better time for New York. Sure, it was sandwiched between the 1975 fiscal crisis and the insane summer of 1977, when the .44 caliber killer was still at large and Bushwick erupted in riots. Still, it was a brief respite when, before legalized pot, patriotism could produce a high. You wouldn't know it yet, but we're only 3 years away from the nation's 250th birthday, if you're counting from July 4th, 1776, which was celebrated as the date independence was declared. A few days later, General George Washington read the Declaration to his troops, not in Philadelphia or Boston, but in New York. Today, the 4th of July is celebrated with department store sales and a hot dog eating contest. But as James Kaplan reminds us in the New York Almanac, the holiday originated as a highly partisan affair to promote what would become the Democratic machine known as Tammany Hall. George Washington Plunkett, the Tammany sage, later lamented, quote, "Nobody pays attention to the 4th of July any longer except Tammany. When the 4th comes, the reformers run off to Newport or the Adirondacks to get out of the way of the noise and everything that reminds them of the glorious day. How different it is with Tammany. Our very Constitution requires that we must assemble regardless of the weather and listen to the reading of the Declaration of Independence and patriotic speeches. You ought to attend one of these meetings. They're a liberal education in patriotism. The Great Hall upstairs is filled with 5,000 people suffocating from heat and smoke. And every man knows that down in the basement, there's 100 cases of champagne and 200 kegs of beer ready to flow when the signal is given. Yet, that crowd sticks to their seats for 4 solid hours while the Declaration of Independence is read, long-winded orators speak, and the Glee Club sings itself hoarse. Talk about heroism in the battlefield, Plunkett declared. It was called patriotism back then, or politics, or perhaps merely patience. Today, we lament the loss of what we would call civic and civil engagement. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.